I'd like to spend a few minutes introducing the topic of learning outcomes for this module. Depending on where you teach, you may or may not have spent a lot of time thinking about learning outcomes explicitly for your courses. As both a faculty member and an instructional designer, I find it very important to start off thinking about learning outcomes, whether I am helping faculty develop resources and activities for their courses or whether I'm planning my own. There are a lot of formal definitions of course outcomes, learning objectives, course goals that you can look through, but I want to keep it much more basic than that. When I'm thinking about my course, I'm thinking about we've got students who are coming in my course, they're starting off at point A, and essentially we want to move them to point B. But it's actually much more complicated than that, of course, because our students all come in with their own point A's in terms of their backgrounds, their understanding, and so forth. And then, as an instructor, I want to set up learning activities and resources and so forth that will allow the students to get to whatever point B that they need to get to. And typically, our courses will have a variety of point Bs that we want our students to get to, whether it's specific knowledge that they need to gain, skills, and so forth. Those outcomes from our courses then can obviously feed into the rest of the curriculum that the students are going to be involved in, whether in our major or across campus. But some of the outcomes may just be for them as lifelong learners. And so we want to have a clear idea of what we're trying to set up our students to accomplish so that we can know whether our students are accomplishing those things and whether or not we need to modify or adjust what we're doing to help them along their way. There are a variety of frameworks that you can use, learning taxonomies, to help you develop and make explicit the learning outcomes for your courses. Many of you may be familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. In particular, most of you who are familiar with Bloom's taxonomy are probably familiar with Bloom's taxonomy for cognitive knowledge. And I find it useful working with faculty with Bloom's taxonomy because it allows the faculty to think about at what level they need to pitch their course. Bloom's taxonomy in the cognitive domain is basically a scaffolded approach where there are some what we would call lower order thinking skills, just students remembering material, understanding it, and then eventually working up to being able to apply it. And then at the top of this hierarchy are all the various higher order thinking skills. Can the students take the knowledge that they've acquired, use it to apply and analyze different situations, evaluate, create new knowledge? So that comparison between lower order thinking skills and higher order thinking skills will be useful as you're thinking about learning outcomes, depending upon whether you're teaching a more introductory course, in which case it's very appropriate to focus on a lot of these lower order thinking skills, or if you are teaching an upper level course where you want to make sure that you've got at least some application of these higher order thinking skills. Although throughout your course, the students may need to, rely on some of these more basic levels in Bloom's in order to scaffold their way up to the higher order thinking skills, activities that you want them to work on. If you do a search on the web, either Google Images or just Google, to do a search for Bloom's taxonomy verbs, you'll come across lots and lots of lists of different ways of stating what you want the students to accomplish that apply to these different levels of cognitive development on the part of the students. So at the basic level of these lower order thinking skills, this basic knowledge or remembering part, can they define, can they identify, can they label, like on a lab practical, can they match, can they recognize, as opposed to, can they design or compose or invent or substitute, construct, at this more upper end, higher order thinking skills. So, as you are thinking about developing the learning outcomes for your COIL collaboration, think in terms of lower order versus higher order thinking skills, and make use of these lists of verbs to give you ideas about how you might want to frame, how you might want to phrase what you want your students to accomplish in your COIL collaboration. If you have encountered Bloom in the past, most likely you've encountered, as we've been talking about, Bloom's taxonomy for the cognitive domain, which is this hierarchical relationship of lower order thinking skills to higher order thinking skills. But Bloom actually set up two other taxonomies. The psychomotor or skills taxonomy is more for physical learning kinds of activities. One that I want to highlight, though, for our purposes, especially for those of you involved in setting up your learning outcomes for your COIL collaborations, is this Bloom's taxonomy for the affective domain, or basically course outcomes that deal with attitudes and the ability for students to to be receptive to attitudes from people from other cultures, respond to, value, and organize. And so, just as there's this hierarchy of lower order to higher order thinking skills for the cognitive domain, you should realize that if you are having those intercultural relationships be a part of your learning outcomes for your collaboration, that you can again figure out how to scaffold what you're having your students do so that they can be open to be receptive in understanding the attitudes and perspectives of others. So this brings into focus a main distinction I want to bring up for you as you are thinking about your learning outcomes for your collaboration and for your courses. You can think about whether you are focusing on disciplinary outcomes or to the extent that you are having one of your students to develop various intercultural competencies as part of the COIL collaboration. Either or both of these are reasonable kinds of learning outcomes for a COIL collaboration. From the disciplinary perspective, you partnering your course with another course provides a prime opportunity to bring students into collaboration with your students who are coming from a different disciplinary perspective. Even if it's say two environmental studies courses, my environmental studies course here with the colleagues from Mexico, the students are probably going to bring different disciplinary perspectives on environmental studies to their projects looking at various topics. And in doing so, hopefully both classes get a much more enriched experience in terms of studying the discipline by having the collaboration with others. But there's also, by definition, going to be students negotiating collaborations with their peers from different cultures. And so you can more explicitly or in the background also think about how you want to structure the collaborations and the outcomes you want out of the collaborations in terms of making your students and the students from your partner's course better able to deal with these intercultural kinds of collaborations. So as you and your partner jointly develop your thinking about the collaboration, you realize that in terms of learning outcomes for the collaboration and for your courses as a whole, there are going to be some outcomes that you and your partner will have in common for your students and his or her students in the collaboration. But it's perfectly reasonable for you to have additional outcomes for your course that are either related to the course outside of the collaboration or could be related to the collaboration but from a perspective from your course that's not an applicable outcome for your partner's course, and vice versa. So I've got this kind of yours, mine, and ours. So as you are thinking about learning outcomes for your courses and for the collaboration, remember that you are talking about disciplinary versus intercultural, or both, or either. What's the balance going to be there? There are cognitive or knowledge outcomes, skills, and attitudes that can be the basis for outcomes for your courses. And I like to think of this in terms of ASK, attitudes or affective outcomes, S for skills, and knowledge. And then, which of those go in the joint outcomes that you want students from both classes to attain, and which are applicable just to your class or to your partner's class. So I've uploaded a number of handouts. They're relatively short, a few pages each, that you can use to draw on as resources for working together to develop outcomes for your collaboration. The first two are very good in terms of walking through the process of constructing learning outcomes. They provide examples of good learning outcomes, other examples of learning outcomes that could be improved because they're too vague or whatever. This article on effective use of learning outcomes is useful for a couple of different things. It introduces this SMART mnemonic or framework, in that learning outcomes should be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and targeted. But this handout also provides examples of other learning taxonomies besides Bloom's taxonomy. In particular, I think it goes into Fink's learning taxonomy, which you might find a useful way to think about learning outcomes. And then I've uploaded one other document, which is the value rubric from the AAC&U, the American Association of Colleges and Universities, LEAP project, which is Liberal Education and America's Promise. It's a project they had undergoing for quite some time. And I've uploaded the value rubric for the intercultural knowledge and competencies. Knowledge. Essential skill. To the extent that you do want to focus on intercultural outcomes as well as disciplinary outcomes when you're thinking about your learning outcomes for your course and your collaboration, you may find this AAC&U document to be useful. So, look through those handouts, take some time to brainstorm with your partner about what topics you want to begin to focus your learning outcomes about for the collaboration and how they may be different or common between the two courses as you come to the collaboration. And then frame those into a handful of specific learning outcomes that are going to be shared across the two classes for your collaboration, and post those into the discussion forum for this module. And we'll use those as the basis for doing some workshopping in our Collaborate session next week.